probably physics will never tell us with absolute certainty that that the universe had a beginning, time had a beginning. And the reason, well, first of all, I think most people, it seems somehow most likely that the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe, and therefore also the beginning of time. But it is also possible, conceivable, that that there was a pre-Big Bang history of the universe. And the Big Bang was just some episode in a longer history of the universe. Um, there are no completely satisfactory physics models of that. They all have problems of one sort or another. It's not really a theory, it's really more a speculative idea. Um, but even if the universe had a pre-Big Bang history, there are some strong arguments that probably it had to have a beginning at some point.
Hi, welcome to the Society of Catholic Scientists podcast, The Catholic Scientist. I'm Dr. Dan Keebler, one of the co-hosts, and I'm joined with my esteemed co-host, Dr. Stephen Barr. Steve, good to see you again.
It's here I am, and it's good to see you, Dan, on this fine morning.
Yeah, so Steve, what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to just pick your brain a little bit about the question of creation and how it relates to the Big Bang, because I know there's a lot of confusion out there about what creation means and what the Big Bang demonstrates about creation. So we want to see what the connection is there. So, yeah, why don't we go ahead and just sort of jump right in to this? And I want to start with, you know. A lot of people see the Big Bang as supporting the Catholic idea of creation ex nihilo, right? And I know, like, sort of when the theory of the Big Bang came out, that term was a pejorative term because a lot of scientists early on resisted the idea of the Big Bang because it did seem to imply the universe has a beginning. Is that right? Is that a
Yes,
good?
right. Yeah, that's right. One reason that in the 1950s, many scientists resisted the idea of the Big Bang theory was that it struck them as kind of suggesting, well, not only suggesting the beginning of the universe, but it seemed to give aid and comfort to the idea that the universe was created, and it seemed too religious. And in fact, Pope Pius XII was very excited back in those days about the Big Bang theory. And he gave a famous address to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in 1951. You can actually go online and if you look that up, read it. And he was celebrating in that pontifical address. He was celebrating the idea that the fact that modern science, cosmology, physics, geology, other fields, we're all, as he said, converging to the conclusion that the universe had a beginning billions of years ago. And the reason he was celebrating is, back in ancient times, the pagan Greek philosophers like Aristotle had thought that the universe had always existed for infinite time. And many modern atheists also believed that the universe had always existed for infinite time. And so um, and so the idea that the universe might have had a beginning was sort of started to get treated as perhaps just a religious idea, maybe a relic of creation myths and so on. And then along comes science, and along comes the Big Bang theory, and says no, the universe actually seems to have had a beginning, and that's why Pius XII was very excited, and he wrote this or he gave this address. Um, in fact, he was so enthusiastic about the Big Bang theory, the idea that the universe had a beginning, or that science was showing that Father Georges Lemaitre, who is kind of the father of the Big Bang theory, as most people now know, this Catholic priest and physicist and mathematician Georges Lemaitre. he was nervous about it. Apparently privately sent message to Pius XII, cool it on the Big Bang because it hasn't yet been proven. And he didn't want the Pope, I guess we would say, get out ahead of his skis on this because
Yeah,
it was
right.
still not. It was still a controversial theory at the time. But anyway, the Pope. So both the atheists and the Pope saw in the Big Bang theory somehow a confirmation, or somehow the ideas as a suggestion that the universe was created.
Yeah, so it seemed to resonate sort of with
Right.
Catholic teaching to in their eyes. Well, there are people that still see that, but there also are people, modern popularizers of the Big Bang, who see sort of the opposite, that the Big Bang is a threat to creation. They'll argue, "Hey, look, the Big Bang theory, certain physics theories can explain the Big Bang in a materialistic way, therefore we don't need God anymore." Late Stephen Hawking was sort of famous for this type of argument. So, in your view, does the Big Bang theory show that the universe was created or was not created?
Well, the short answer is I don't think it shows either. Uh,
Okay. You
as
always
you
take the
said,
cop out. Okay.
as
No,
you
no, I'm
said,
kidding.
yeah. I mean, and that well, it's not a cop out, but see,
Okay.
but as you and I probably both had the experience of, if I've had Catholics come up to me and they seem to say, "Isn't the Big Bang theory like an atheist idea?" I mean, they see the Big Bang theory as somehow atheistic, and I say, "Hey, it was proposed by a Catholic priest, and the Pope Pius XII loved it."
Yeah.
Um, and Hawking, as you say, Stephen Hawking, said we don't need God anymore to explain how the universe began because physics is going to explain all that. He said, the quantum gravity, yeah, the physics is going to understand how the universe began, and therefore it's going to show we don't need a creator. But my answer is that to both these groups. So there are those who say the Big Bang proves creation, and others say the Big Bang proves there wasn't a creation. There's no creator, and I would say they're kind of both wrong because I would say because I don't think the
Okay.
Big Bang. I don't think physics actually, as we'll see from our later discussion, I hope. I don't think physics tells you anything about the creation of the universe. It only tells you something about the beginning of the universe, and I want to kind of distinguish those two ideas of
Yeah.
beginning
Yeah.
and
People
creation.
often conflate beginning and creation. So that, yeah.
Right now, I think before we get into that, I mean, I think we have to back up and talk about what the word creation means
Yeah.
when Catholic teaching says and that God created the universe, and God creating the universe is so unlike anything. I mean, it's something that is mysterious because it's an act of God. It is a divine act, and so it's not something within our experience, and therefore we can't fully comprehend the idea, but we can use analogies. The only way we can approach it is through analogies. And there are different analogies that one can use. There's a very common, I would say the most common analogy, it's found in scripture, it's found, and I think the average person thinks in terms of this analogy, um, is of a human being making something.
Yeah.
And this is a good analogy, and I think it gets you a certain distance, but I don't think it has its limitations, and it can be misleading in important ways. But so that I think is the sort of the more common analogy. It's a human being. God made the universe in the same way, like a builder makes a house, or in the same way a painter makes a painting, and God makes the universe. But there's a deeper, there are deeper ways of thinking about this that are part of Catholic tradition that one finds in St. Thomas Aquinas and I think in St. Augustine that we can also talk about, which I think avoid some of misunderstandings that
Yeah, it would be good. So maybe
cause.
you can elaborate on those different ways of seeing creation that go beyond that very common way that you talked about, like the house builder, just taking something and creating something as a builder or a painter.
Right.
Like, what's the more sort of the deeper view of creation?
Right. So, as I said, the common one is like God builds the universe back in the day, whether you're a fundamentalist who say 6,000, 10,000 years old or billions of, God builds the universe in much the same way that a human beings build a house, a construction
Right.
workers build a house, or as I said, a painter paints a painting, or a craftsman makes something. Um, when humans when humans make things in that way, the thing that they're making actually begins to exist at the time they make it, right? So the building begins to exist when it's built, and it may say on the cornerstone, built in
Right.
1956. That's when it was made, and that's when it started. That was its beginning. And the same with a painting begins to exist when it's painting. So human making, that analogy tends to make us think that the making of the thing, the creation of it, is the same thing as the beginning of it. The two ideas, and in fact, Scripture uses that language too. I mean, it says in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning,
Right.
God created the heavens and the earth. So beginning equals. You might jump to the conclusion, okay, beginning equals creation. That's why people say, oh, the Big Bang says the universe had a beginning, or that it suggests that. And so,
Right.
beginning equals creation. So the Big Bang is creation. So that's, and it's not just, and also many important philosophers and theologians think in those terms as well. So a very important example. Well, most of the medieval scholastics thought in that way. So, for example, Saint Bonaventure, the great Franciscan theologian who is a almost exact contemporary of St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Bonaventure virtually equated beginning and creation. He said, if something is created, then it has to have a beginning. And if it has a beginning, that means it was created. And for him, the two were inseparable and virtually the same idea. And there's a modern an argument that's not modern, but uh, um, that's getting a lot of traction, or it's getting more popular. An argument for the existence of God, or a purported proof of the existence of God, called the Kalam argument, Kalam, and it's been popularized by a very well-known Christian apologist, Protestant uh, gentleman named William Lane Craig. He's a
Right.
philosopher, a respected philosopher, but he's also more famous as a Christian apologist. And he has really pushed this Kalam argument, and some Catholic philosophers have also taken it up. And so the Kalam argument is sort of based on this idea. So what it says, it has two parts. It says, first, we will prove that the universe had a beginning. That is, it didn't stretch infinitely into the past, but it
Okay.
has a finite past. It began at some finite time ago. That's step one. And step two is the major premise that if anything has a beginning, if it begins to exist at some finite time ago, then it must have a cause that is outside of itself. And that, of course, is suggested by all the examples that you're talking about. Like a building began to exist at a certain time, and we know it had a cause outside of itself, namely the construction workers. And a painting had a beginning at a definite time, and it had a cause outside of itself, which is the painter. And so, by that logic, once you've shown the universe has a beginning in time, then it must have a cause outside of itself. Well, what can the cause of the universe be? It's outside of the universe. That's God. Okay, so that's the Kalam argument.
Yeah. So what's your thought on that argument? What about what are those two premises do you think might
Well, I think the
both good?
problem with the Kalam argument, the big problem with it, in my view, is that it's hard to prove the minor premise, namely that the universe had a beginning in time. Um, Now, one way you might try to argue that the universe had a beginning is say, well, Scripture teaches that in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, it talks about a
Yeah.
beginning, and the church has always taught that the universe had a beginning. That is a teaching of our faith that had a beginning at some finite time ago. Now, the trouble is you can't use that in the Kalam argument because the Kalam argument is supposed to be proving the existence of God to an agnostic
Yeah. Right. Okay.
or an atheist, and of course, so you can't use Scripture and church teaching as a with them. So if you're going to prove to them that the universe had a beginning and time, you're going to have to use only reason, not revelation. So you have to use philosophical arguments, or you have to use uh, scientific, empirical science arguments. And the problem is, it's very hard, if it's at all possible. I'm skeptical that it's even possible, but it's very hard to prove by reason alone, whether philosophical or scientific, that the universe had a beginning in time. And so, in fact, St. Thomas Aquinas himself was of the view, he didn't say you couldn't prove that, but he said St. Thomas Aquinas said he was aware of no compelling argument, philosophical argument, that the universe must have had a beginning in time. He looked, in fact, he looked at various arguments that people like St. Bonaventure had given, and he
Yeah.
said that they're fallacious and that he wasn't aware of any compelling argument that the universe had a beginning in time. And therefore, the only way we know is, well, he said, in fact, he thought it was both. I mean, he didn't say it in these words necessarily, but he clearly thought that it was both logically and metaphysically conceivable that the universe had an infinite past. That there was no logical absurdity about that. There was no metaphysical absurdity about the universe having an infinite past. And that in fact, God, therefore, if he could have created such a universe, because God can create anything that's not sort of a metaphysical or logical absurdity. So God, he said, had the power, if he had wanted to create a universe that had an infinite past. And that, but we know that in fact, God chose to do otherwise. He chose to create a world that did have a beginning. And we only know that, he said, because it's been revealed to us in Scripture. So,
Great.
so that was St. Thomas's view, is that so he clearly distinguished. You can see from this that St. Thomas clearly distinguished creation from beginning, because he thought you could prove philosophically that the world is created and that God exists. You can prove that, he said, philosophically, but he was skeptical of the idea that you could prove philosophically that the universe had a beginning. So beginning and creation for him were two different things. And
Yeah.
they said he thought God could create a universe that had no beginning.
Okay. So yeah, with that, I mean, it seems like with St. Thomas that he
Yes.
talks about, the first mover are, the five ways of St. Thomas, and those seem to imply to a lot of people that, oh, that means there must be a beginning. So,
Right.
if you
Well, I'm
trace it
not sure
back to
this,
first mover,
I forget the five ways, but I'm not sure is the first mover one of them. I'm not sure, but he did have a first mover argument. And a lot of people people have said to me, but of course St. Thomas must have believed that you could prove there was a beginning because he had the first mover argument, right? I mean,
right?
doesn't that prove that it was a beginning? And it doesn't, because people, almost, I think 99% of the people out there, maybe 99.9% of people who've heard of the first mover argument, have a completely mistaken idea of what it was.
Yeah.
What 99.9% of people out there think that the first mover argument is sort of like dominoes. Like, okay, here's a domino moving. It likes falling over. Well, if it's falling over, if it's moving, something must have moved it. So what moved it? Another domino that fell before it. And then what
Right.
moved that one? Well, there was a domino before that moved it. And then one before that moved it. And there's a sequence of falling dominoes. And the idea is, so people think, that, well, you can't have that going on forever into the past. There had to be a first domino. It had to be a
Well,
first mover. Or you could use uh, billiard balls, a game of pool. Well, this pool ball is moving, and then that was because it was hit by this other one, which was moves because it was hit by this other one, which was hit by this other one. And there had to be a first moving billiard ball or pool ball, which was the cue ball. And so that's what they think is the first mover. But if that's what it means, there's a sequence of events in time, a sequence of causes and effects in time, and there was a first one, and therefore that was the first thing that happened. That was therefore the beginning of the world, right? That's not at all what St. Thomas meant. And we know what makes this very clear. Oh, he said, but what makes it very clear, he looked at that as what he called non-simultaneously acting causes. Like A happens before B and causes B. This domino falls, and later another domino falls as a result. Or this, he called those non-simultaneously acting causes. Causes act in a time sequence.
right.
And he said he saw no reason that such a sequence of events could not, as he said, go back infinitely into the past. And he said, for example, he used the example. He said, as a man might be begotten by his father, who was begotten by his father, who was begotten by his father. And he said, there's no reason that he could see philosophically why this sequence of fathers and sons couldn't have gone back infinitely into the past with no first father, right? And people are shocked to hear that, but that's what St. Thomas says very explicitly. He was thinking, I'm not going to explain his first mover argument, but it's much more subtle. And it's using a set of concepts that are not very familiar to us today. But first of all, when he's talking about moving, he wasn't talking of motion through space necessarily. He was using motion in a technical sense in Aristotelian philosophy. But he was talking about what he called simultaneously acting causes. And his argument was really not about a chain of events unfolding in time. It was about a sequence, it's about an explanatory chain where I explain A from B, and and the explanation of B is C, and the explanation of C is D, and so on. He said a chain of explanations has to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's a different kind of thing than a chain of events. So he's talking about a chain of explanations. You can sort of see that in mathematics. If I say, I'm going to prove this theorem, well, this theorem follows as a consequence of this other statement, which follows from this other statement, which follows from this other statement, and follows from, well, if you have a proof, that you have to start your proof with something. If your
Yeah.
sequence of explanations goes back to infinitely far, then you haven't proven anything. And so that's what he's talking about. So anyway, the upshot is that St. Thomas did not think there was a compelling, convincing argument that a chain of events, including the universe, had to have a first event. And he said there's so many words. And the first mover, people should not use the first mover argument. It does a
Yeah.
lot
No,
of
I think
damage, in my view, because
yeah, I
it's
think a lot of people
misunderstood. The
see
sort of
it
the
the way.
common notion of it is actually a bad argument. St. Thomas said it's a bad argument. The common notion of it is a bad argument. St. Thomas thought it was a bad argument. I might spent about 45 minutes talking to an atheist graduate student from mainland China. And he said, and he was an atheist, how about this first mover argument's a bunch of nonsense? They said, why can't these things go back into the past? And I said, that's not the first mover argument. And no matter how many times I told him that, he kept saying, but St. Thomas said this, and
Yeah.
it's bad. And I said, so it does a lot of damage.
Yeah. So, a lot of people, though, I think might still be bothered in the sense that, how can you talk about something that's always existed as being created? It seems like for a lot of people, they would intuit, well, you don't need to now. It's always existed. It's just there. So you don't need to create it. It seems to be a contradiction there.
Yeah, that's right. I think that is actually what a lot of people, and not just a lot of people, even famous philosophers and theologians would say is, look, if something's always existed, how can it be created? Because if you create something, as I said before, then and that's when it starts to exist. And I would use a different. I would like to explain that with a different analogy. This isn't that of St. Thomas, but it's sort of capturing, I think, the way he thought about things. So I want to use an analogy, not of a builder. So right now I'm sitting at a desk and there's a lamp on my desk, and I have a piece of paper in front of me with notes reminding me what I was going to say. And the piece of paper is illuminated by the lamp. The paper has brightness; it's bright, and it's bright. And the cause of its being bright is the lamp. If I turn off the lamp, paper will be dark. So the brightness of the paper has a cause, which is the lamp. Now that says nothing in itself about whether the paper has been bright for a finite time or for infinite time. It's quite possible, I mean, not in real life, but, philosophically,
Yeah, right.
it's conceivable that a piece of paper is sitting there that has been bright for infinite time. It's always been bright because it's always been illuminated by a lamp. There's this lamp that never goes out. So it's always had a cause of its brightness, the lamp, which has always been shining, but it has no beginning in time to its brightness. So the analogy is then the universe is, think of a set of brightness and the cause of brightness. Think of being, existing, and a cause of existence. So the universe exists, and it has its existence because of a cause of being, a cause of existence, which is God. If God, as it were, withdrew his creative power, his cause, ceased to cause the universe to exist, the universe would vanish. It would disappear instantly. It would vanish. Now, God is the cause of being of the universe, but that doesn't tell us how long the universe has been in existence. It could
Right.
have been in existence for infinite time, with God always causing that existence. And as I said, if the God ever withdrew his causal power, the universe would vanish. In fact, the Catechism quotes Vatican II uh, as saying, without the creator, the creature vanishes.
Yeah. And
We
so that's the
only
Catholic.
exist right now. You and I only exist because God is holding us in existence by his creative power.
Right.
And in fact, the letter to the Hebrews says, I think it's Hebrews 1 3, says, God upholds all things by the word of his power. He holds all things in being by the word of his power. So he's doing that all the time. So that is the analogy I would use, and it shows you that it makes perfect sense, thought of in those terms, to say that something has always existed, but is always being held in existence and caused to exist by God.
Yeah, so that is sort of the Catholic dogma of creation, the teaching that God conserves all things in being at every moment in time, and so God's always creating, right? There's no
Right.
difference between creation now and 10 years ago, 100 years ago. He's always the creator.
Right. So that's exactly. So the traditional language that's often used is that God causes things at the beginning, and then he conserves things in being. So there's this traditional notion of God both causing things to be when they start to be, and then conserving them in being. But that distinction is kind of looking at things from our own time-bound point of view. Like from the creature's point of view, we tend to distinguish a creation at the beginning and a conserving later. But from God's point of view, as it were, they're the same thing. It's not like God does one thing, which is create, and another thing, which is conserve. It's really the same act. And I think that's what Catholic tradition says, that they're really creating, conserving are one and the same thing, God giving being. And here's another analogy. I love analogies. I'm imitating St. Thomas, who always used analogies. And I think a very helpful analogy in making all this clearer is a novel and a novelist. Um, Instead of the construction worker builds the house, or the construction workers build the house, and then they go away, and then the house is there and carries on. Okay. But
Yeah,
think of a novel and a novelist. So the novelist doesn't just write the first words he's the cause of the existence of the novel. But he doesn't just write the first words of the novel. He writes all the words of the novel equally. So he is the author, yes, of the words that come at the beginning, but he's just as much the author of the words in the middle and the end. Every single word actually is equally coming from the mind of the novelist. So he equally creates at the beginning things at the beginning and things that are not at the beginning. So it's all the same with the novelist. He's the creator. He's the, in some sense, the creator of the whole work equally.
Yeah, so we shouldn't see like you mentioned Genesis 1, it says, "In the beginning, God created," that we shouldn't just then assume that, that's the only time God created. It's not
Right.
inferred that
That's
He
right.
only created at the beginning.
Right. So that's we shouldn't. It's true that Genesis says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," but we shouldn't deduce from that that's when creation happened, and God stopped creating after that. And creation is something that God did a long time ago, whether thousands of years if you're a fundamentalist Protestant, or billions of years, as we now know. That God did, it's something God did once upon a time, a long time ago. No, God is upholding all things in being. And in fact, the Catechism sort of agrees with that we shouldn't read Genesis 1:1 in that way. It says in I have it written down here in section 290 of the Catechism. It says it's explaining Genesis 1:1, and it says three things are affirmed in these first words of Scripture. Three things. First is that the eternal God gave a beginning to all things that exist outside of Himself. The second thing is He alone is Creator. And the third thing is that the totality of what exists, expressed by the formula, the heavens and the earth, depends on the one who gives it being. So it's distinguishing the one thing in that verse. He gives a beginning to the universe, but he also creates the universe in the sense of giving it being, and it distinguishes those two ideas. And in fact, in the early church fathers, like St. Augustine, but many of the others, they didn't just take the words "in the beginning" in Genesis, in the beginning, to mean a time a long time ago. They yes, it did mean that. They did take it to mean that the universe had a beginning a long time ago. But they also took beginning to have other deeper meanings. It meant the origin, the ultimate source of the world. The beginning of the world was its ultimate source. And so they identified that generally with the divine wisdom. So St. Augustine said at one point that God created the world, oh Lord, you created the world in your word, in your power, in your son, in your wisdom. And then he went on to say, your, your wisdom is the beginning in which you made the world. And then he quotes the Old Testament saying, wisdom is the beginning of his ways. Wisdom is the beginning of his ways. So in the beginning, God created the world. They also read that as God created the world in his wisdom. He is in Latin, it's in principio, right? In the beginning. But the principio also meant the principle, the principle, the source, the origin of the world was God. And that was his wisdom and power.
Well,
So
it's
anyway,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that's a good distinction there to theological distinction between creation and the beginning. So let's shift back to maybe a little bit about the physics of the Big Bang, and how we might look at that. So I mean, clearly based on what you said, yeah, we shouldn't just equate the Big Bang with creation. God has not just created the Big Bang; He created every moment of the universe, every unfolding moment. He gives that being, right?
right.
But if that's the case, then what can the Big Bang tell us about creation at all or anything? Yeah.
Well, okay. Now I would say then, based on everything we've said, that it doesn't. The Big Bang theory does, in physics in general, can't tell us anything about creation. That is God's giving being to the universe. It can tell us about what happened in the earliest moments of the universe. Okay. And again, going back to the novel analogy, um, in a novel, the beginning of the novel are just the first words, whereas the creation, and that doesn't really tell us why there's a novel. So I use the example of a novel that I haven't read by Dickens, the novel A Tale of Two Cities. I read other books by Dickens. When I was
Okay.
a kid, I read several books by Dickens, which I love, but I never read A Tale of Two Cities. And The Tale of Two Cities had a very famous beginning words. The opening words of the novel were, I'm told, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Now, if somebody came up to you with a copy of A Tale of Two Cities and said, where did this novel come from? Like, how did we end up having this novel, A Tale of Two Cities? Not the physical copy in his hands, but the novel.
Yeah.
If I took the novel and I opened it, the first words, and say, oh, the reason there's a novel, The Tale of Two Cities, is because of this right here. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And I pointed to the first words in the novel. I would be an idiot. That would be silly. Those are simply the first words of the novel. They don't explain why there's a novel. The explanation of why there's the novel is there was this fellow named Dickens who conceived of it in his mind and then put it on paper and got it published. It was Dickens is the reason. So it very strongly shows you why beginning and creator are two different, or creation. The creation of the novel happened in the mind of Dickens, and that's different from the first words of the novel. So physics can tell us kind of what the first words of the universe were, like what was going on at the beginning of its plot.
Okay.
What were the events at the time of if the Big Bang was the beginning, which is we don't know for sure. But if the Big Bang was the beginning, in physics, hopefully, it can tell us something about the first events in the universe, something about them, and hopefully, eventually, maybe a great deal about them. But it won't tell us why there's a universe. That's what creation is the explanation for. If you say, why is there a universe at all? The answer to that for Catholic or for Christian is because God created it. God gave it being. God thought of it in his mind, the way Dickens thought of the Tale of Two Cities in his mind. God thought up the whole plot of the universe in his mind and gave it reality.
Okay.
So physics only tells us about some of the events, and so it actually has nothing to say about creation as we understand it at all.
Okay, so when someone like Hawkins, at the end of his life, he said, that physics could explain why there's a universe at all, why there's a universe that, is structured using the laws of quantum gravity and so forth, that
Right.
he was off base in based on what you said in that argument.
Right. He wrote this book. It was like about 10 years before he died. He co-authored it with a guy named Leonard Mlodinow, and I forget, it was called The Grand Design. But in that book, he says, look, we don't need God anymore to explain how the universe began, because, the universe started by a quantum fluctuation from a vacuum state in which there are no universes. And now a quantum fluctuation created a state with a universe. And though we don't have yet a good theory of quantum gravity because it's too difficult, but when we do have a theory of quantum gravity that's adequate, we'll be able to actually calculate and show how the universe began from nothing. And so we won't need God anymore. So that was where he ended up. Physics can explain why there's a universe. But there was a now, already we know why he's mistaken, because he's confusing beginning with creation. But there was a devastating refutation of what Hawking said that had been given, like, I don't know, more than 2 decades earlier by a physicist who was every bit as smart as Hawking, every bit as brilliant as Hawking, had already given a devastating reply to what Hawking said. And you know who that physicist was?
Was that you, Steve?
I wish I wish it were. As a physicist, I'm not fit to untie Hawking's sandals. I'm not.
Okay.
The physicist who gave a devastating refutation of Hawking's later ideas was Hawking. It was Hawking himself in
Okay.
1988. he wrote this book that became a bestseller, and which made him famous with the public, called A Brief History of Time. That was his first, big best-selling popular book. And in that book, he said the following. Had a very perceptive. He hit the nail on the head. What he said is that any theory of physics, any theory of physics is just a set of mathematical rules and equations. That's what a physics theory is. And therefore cannot, and they use that word, therefore cannot explain why there is a universe for those rules to describe. So all theories of physics, he said, are just mathematical rules and equations that, and therefore it just cannot explain why there's actually a universe for in existence for those rules and equations to describe. And that, I think, is the definitive refutation of what he later
Yeah.
said. And the way I explain this is an analogy, which I wasn't clever enough to come up with, but one of my older brother, they gave me this analogy, and I like it. So just like the universe has these laws of physics, the laws of physics, as Hawking said, are a bunch of rules. They're the rules by which the physical universe operate. Okay. Um, they're like the rules of a game. So I don't know whether you like chess or like baseball, you can use either one. So take baseball. Baseball has a set of laws, and I think they're written in books. You can read them somewhere. And
Yeah.
the laws of baseball tell you how baseball game begins. It tells you how the baseball game ends. It tells you the kinds of things that can happen in a baseball game, the sequence in which they happen, how one thing causes another 3 strikes and you're out, and this kind of thing, and the infield fly rule, and and all this kind of stuff. And so it describes how a baseball game unfolds. But one thing those rules do not tell you is whether there actually has ever been a baseball game played, ever has been, ever will be, or is now an actual real baseball game. The rules could just be describing hypothetical baseball games or fictitious baseball games or merely possible baseball games, but no actual baseball game. Not only that, but the rules do not in themselves have the power. These rules in the rule book of baseball
Yeah,
do
right.
not have some magical power by which they cause there to be a baseball game, an actual one. They don't have that power. And what Hawking was perceptively noting in 1988 is the rules of this universe, which are the laws of physics, simply describe how a universe of this type unfolds. If there is a universe of this type, but they don't have the power to make there be an actual universe of this type that follows those rules. And so the laws of physics cannot answer the question of why there's an actual universe. As he said, and then he famously said in 1988, what is it that breathes fire into those equations so that there is a universe for them to describe? And for us, what breathes fire into those equations is God. He not only thought of the rules, I mean, just like the rules of a game, somebody, decides these are the rules. We could have had different rules of baseball, and, and they do change from time to time. People
Yeah, we got a pitch
decide on the
clock
rules.
and it
So
yeah,
people
yeah, and it
decide on the rules that they're going to play by. God decides on the rules, and then not only decides what the rules are going to be, he causes there to be an actual honest to God universe, one that actually, as Hawking said, goes to all the trouble of existing. He causes there to be a universe that actually exists and follows those rules. So that's creation. That is creation. And so physics, Hawking, I think, definitively argued, physics cannot answer the question that creation answers, which is why there's a universe at all. And so that's disappointing, because it kind of said, well, physics is only tells us certain things, but that's the way it is.
Yeah. So we made that distinction between creation and beginning, and you've argued pretty well, and pulling in sources like Hawkins that creation is something that goes beyond on the physics. But then
Right.
let's get back to this beginning. What can we know about the beginning, right? And I guess you mentioned earlier, like we can know about a beginning by philosophical arguments or possibly scientific arguments. So let's take both of those. We want to talk
Okay.
about what does philosophy say about a beginning, and then what does science say about a beginning, right? And so
Right.
let's start with going back to the Kalam argument
Mhm.
that you had talked about before, because at the heart of that is this philosophical argument for a beginning. So maybe you can just talk about that a little bit more.
Right. So the Kalam argument, which, as I said, is actually William Lane Craig, this contemporary Christian apologist, champions this. He's sort of made it famous and popular. Uh, Starts and says, well, I'm going to prove that God exists. First, I will prove to you that the universe had a beginning, and then I'm going to use the principle uh, that anything that has a beginning in time starts to exist at some time must have a cause outside of itself. And if a universe, what else can that be but God? Okay. So they have to first prove, using reason alone, that the universe had a beginning. So they have a set of arguments. I mean, if you talk to various people who buy this way of thinking, um, you ask them, well, how do you prove that the universe had a beginning? Well, you get a number of different answers. A variety. They have a variety of arguments. One that I've encountered a lot, and I'm not talking here about William Lane Craig. I'm talking about just sort of people I meet, Catholic philosophers and so on. They'll say, well, one reason we know is that you can't have an infinite number of actually existing things. And I say, what? And that's an idea that actually goes back to the ancient Greeks. You can't have what they call an actual infinity. You can have a potential infinity, but you can't have an actually existing set, an infinite number of things all existing at the same time. And now actually St. Thomas said you could. I mean, like, yeah, I take that back. He didn't say you could. He didn't think that an infinite past of the universe would be an infinite number of things existing at the same time. It would be an infinite number of things existing one after the other.
The other, right?
So
Yeah,
he didn't see anything wrong with that. He might have, I don't know what he thought about whether you can have an actual infinity, but he thought, well, if the universe had an infinite past, it just meant that there's only could be a finite number of things in existence at any one time, but there's an infinite number of times. So anyway, but I asked them, well, where do you get this principle that you can't have an actual infinity? And they say, well, it's obvious. It's self-evident. I say it's not obvious to me. And that could be because I'm an idiot or stupid, and I don't think it's obvious I don't think it'd be obvious to most physicists. In fact, before the Big Bang Theory, most physicists thought that's what the world did have an infinite past. And most physicists would say, I don't see why the universe can't be infinitely large and have an infinite amount of stuff all existing at the same time. So I mean, it's not a very good. What I would say is this: it's not a good argument unless if your self-evident thing that you're starting from isn't self-evident to the person you're trying to convince, because then your
right.
argument simply falls flat. So, but that's not how the more clever people argue. So there are a set of arguments. Some of them go back to Saint Bonaventure, who now Saint Bonaventure had a whole set of arguments to prove that the universe had a beginning in time. And I won't go through all of them. One of them is that you can't. Um, well, one he had some clever ones. One one was, okay, let's suppose we number the past days. He was thinking of the past of the universe in terms of days.
Yeah,
So he said, let's number the days in the past, and there are even numbered days and odd numbered days. And if there's an infinite number of days, then there'll also be an infinite number of even numbered days. But that's crazy because the even numbered days are only a part of all the past days, but they're infinite, and all the past days are also infinite in number. But you can't have one infinity having more things than another infinity. Like the whole past has an infinite number, and the even numbered days have an infinite number of them. And so one of these is bigger than the other, right? But they have both infinite. So how can one infinity be bigger than another? Well, actually, to a modern mathematician, there's nothing wrong with two sets, one containing the other, and yet they have the same number of things. So that's simply paradoxical, but nothing contradictory about that. But another argument he had is that, well, if there's an infinite number of past days, then if one more day goes by, you have just added to infinity, because now we have an infinite past days plus another day just went by. And so you now have even more than infinity. But you can't have more than infinity. You can't add to infinity. St. Thomas Aquinas says, yes, you can. You can't add to the infinite past at the beginning, because there was no, but you can add to it at the end. Why not? So, but then here's the most, the sort of the main argument I think St. Bonaventure had. And that is, he said, you cannot traverse an infinite series. You can't traverse an infinite number of steps. And so what he's essentially arguing is this: if there's a infinite number of past days, then surely there must have been some past day that was infinitely far in the past. If there's an infinite past, there must, he said, have been at least one day that was infinitely far in the past. So consider that infinitely remote past day. Well, then you have a problem, because the day after that was also infinitely in the past. And the day after that would have been infinitely in the past. And any number of days after that, no matter how many days after that you elapse, you're still infinitely far in the past. And therefore, you can't get from there to here, because you can't
Right. Yeah.
traverse an infinite number. You can't, one day at a time, get from that infinitely remote past date to the present, because you'd have to go through the whole infinite number, and you can't do that. And St. Thomas pointed out the fallacy there, which is, the fallacy is immediately obvious to a person who studies math in our day. Because consider the set of natural numbers: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It goes on forever. There's an infinite number of numbers. 1, 2, 3. There's no end to them. There's an infinite set, and yet every single number in that set is finite. No matter what number you choose, 17 or 20 million, no matter if you pick a particular number, it's a finite number. So you have an infinite number, but every single number in that infinite set is finite. In the same way, any particular past day, even if there's an infinite number of past days, even if the past stretches forever, if you pick a particular past day, it's going to be a finite time in the past. And therefore, you can get from there to here by the passage of time. St. Thomas understood this. In fact, he gave that very answer. He said, because there being an infinite past does not mean that there is some day in the past that's infinitely far in the past. Every past day, particular day, is a finite time. St. Thomas was a smart cookie.
Very smart, man.
Very smart. Now,
Good
I don't want to
mathematical
insult
point.
my Franciscan friends, because, like, St. Thomas is the big gun of the Dominicans, and St.
Yeah, right.
Bonaventure
Yeah.
is the big gun of the Franciscans. But St. Bonaventure's arguments for the philosophical arguments that the past had to be finite are all fallacious. And St. Thomas recognized the fallacy in every single one of them, which is quite remarkable, because I think, we have the benefit of living after the 19th century, where a lot of thinking was done about infinity by
Right.
mathematicians. And so a lot of the fallacies are obvious to us, but the fact that they were obvious to St. Thomas says a lot for his perspicuity. But anyway,
Yeah. Well, that's a good take on the philosophical arguments for a beginning, and some of the weaknesses for those arguments there.
but I
And
want to
allows
say
you to say,
before I want to stay on
okay,
that one more sec, because there are some very smart philosophers of our time. I don't want to mention their names, so I don't want to embarrass them, but there are some very, very smart philosophy, professors of philosophy, who are trying to come up with better arguments than Bonaventure had. And one of them is, I won't go into it, it's very clever. It's called the Grim Reaper paradox. And what they're trying to show, and there are various versions of this, they're trying to show that you cannot have an infinite sequence of causes, that there's something metaphysically impossible about having an infinite sequence of causes without that go back without a beginning. Um, and they're basically trying to use this idea that you can't traverse an infinite number of steps, but they do it in a more clever way than Bonaventure was doing it. And I don't want to get into. It'd be fun to talk about that, but it would take a while. And I'm not. I in my own mind, I'm not decided whether this Grim Reaper paradox proves what they want to prove. I think it proves something, but I don't think it necessarily proves what they want it to prove. But I should say that there are sophisticated attempts
Yeah.
to 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 prove the past was finite.
Okay. Yeah, we'll let our listeners jump into they can
Yeah,
go search up that argument and see if they wanna follow that. But I wanna ask you here at the end a couple questions about, what does the physics show about the beginning? Because a lot of people say, "Well, didn't time come into existence at the Big Bang, so that
yeah,
would be a beginning, right? So doesn't the Big Bang demonstrate a beginning in time and so a
right.
beginning?"
Now,
Yeah,
in a way, probably physics will never tell us with absolute certainty that that the universe had a beginning, time had a beginning. And the reason, well, first of all, the I think most people it seems somehow most likely that the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe, and therefore also the beginning of time. But it is also possible, conceivable, that that there was a pre-Big Bang history of the universe, and the Big Bang was just some episode in a longer history of the universe. Um, there are no completely satisfactory physics models of that. They all have problems of one sort or another. It's not really a theory, it's really more a speculative idea. Um, but even if the universe had a pre-Big Bang history, there are some strong arguments that probably it had to have a beginning at some point. However, all such arguments assume things. Whenever you prove anything in math or physics, you always have there's some assumptions in your argument, and those
yeah,
assumptions might turn out to be false. So uh, the other thing is we can't. It's hard to imagine how we could ever look past the Big Bang, peer into to see whether something happened before the Big Bang, because the Big Bang kind of would have wiped out any trace of what happened before it. Like you can't. It's like how do you see past the Big Bang? Nobody could think. I don't think anyone has thought of a way to do that. But even if we could, you run into kind of a problem that's reminiscent of what we were just talking about. If we were able to look past the Big Bang and peer arbitrarily far into the past, anything we actually saw happening in the past was happening a finite time ago. Like even if the universe had
yeah,
infinite past, every particular event in the history of the universe happened a finite time ago. And so whenever we look at, if we saw something happen before the Big Bang, we saw a galaxy, a star explode or whatever. We're only looking at stuff a finite time ago. So if you can only see a finite things that are happening finite times ago, how do you ever have empirical evidence of an infinite past, right? You can't see and literally cannot see infinite things happening infinitely far back. So, there's so many obstacles to ever resolving
yeah.
this observationally, um,
Is
that
that
it's
similar
hard to
to
imagine science giving a definitive verdict. All we can
yeah,
say is that it's very hard to build sensible models um, that have some of the things that we want models to have, which describe a universe with an infinite past. So probably the universe did have a beginning, but I think as far as a absolutely rigorous proof of that from science, I
yeah.
don't think that's going to happen.
And that similar to, like, our ability to tell whether the universe is infinite or not? Like, we can only see a finite distance away, so then we can't tell if it is
Right.
infinite.
Right.
Right.
I mean, it's same thing. I mean, it's hard to imagine how we'll know how big the universe is. There are very strong arguments, indirect arguments, that it is way bigger than the part we can see because we can only see out to a certain distance. Um, because anything farther than that, light wouldn't have had time to get to us
Right.
since the Big Bang. That's called our horizon. But there are indirect arguments that are very convincing that the universe is probably exponentially larger than what we can see. But whether it's simply exponentially larger or infinitely larger, we can't. I don't think there's a way to know that. Frankly, it's hard to imagine how we could resolve that. Unfortunately, some of the most interesting questions about the universe are probably out of our reach. Practically or even theoretically out of our reach. So it's just like we can't know what's going on inside a black hole
Yeah.
by observation. Somewhat analogously, we can't know what's outside our horizon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you talk about like, something before the Big Bang and being able to see that and it would be destroyed, but are you talking about like these, like bouncing universes and things like that
There
where,
could there
like,
yeah.
something like that, maybe just explain, give somebody an idea of
Well,
what this might look
there are a lot of scenarios. One is called the bouncing universe. Actually, Einstein played with this idea back in the 1930 or so, that the universe is expanding. It expands. It reaches a finite size. I mean, not fi it reaches a maximum size. Then it collapses again. Instead of collapsing to a crunch, then it bounces and starts expanding again. Then it reaches a maximum size. Then it collapses, and it's an endless. And you have a series of bounces. And the idea is that, well, maybe that's been going on forever. And like the Big Bang was just a bounce,
Mhm.
but there was a cycle before that, and a cycle before that, and a cycle before that. It's just one of an infinite number of bounces. That actually doesn't work. And it was shown back in the 30s by a, a scientist named Tolman that that doesn't work. And the basic reason has to do with the second law of thermodynamics, which tells you that I mean, a lot of these scenarios run into problems with the second law of thermodynamics, which tells you that things tend to run down, they tend to wear out, and it's kind of roughly just like you can't have a machine that runs forever, a perpetual motion machine, because the second law of thermodynamics sort of prevents that. Um, a universe that has been around for infinite time would be a kind of perpetual motion machine. It's something that's been running for infinite time and you run into problems. But again, there are clever ways around that. There's something called the ekpyrotic universe scenario. There's also another idea called eternal inflation. And there, the idea is there's a larger universe which is perpetually expanding. And within that larger universe, bubbles form, like in a pot of boiling water. A bubble forms and the bubble expands, and inside that bubble you have like a little mini universe, and that's what we are living inside, such a bubble. And the Big Bang was the point at which our bubble formed.
Okay.
But actually there have been bubbles forming for all, for infinite time. Well, eternal inflation doesn't tell you whether the larger universe, the pot of water, so to speak, has been around forever, but it tells you that there's lots and lots of bubbles forming all the time. And you can imagine that you can extend this back infinitely into the past, where there have been bubbles forming for infinite time in the past. Now, there are strong arguments against that, actually. There's a theorem called the Bordeguth-Vilenkin theorem, which suggests that even in this in the eternal inflation scenario, that this scenario, a larger universe had to have a beginning, probably a finite time ago. So, as I said, there are a lot of scenarios. They're very interesting ones. Um, they're not theories; it's really scenarios. But there are strong arguments that suggest that even when you consider such scenarios, you end up ultimately having a beginning to the
Yeah, just
universe.
at a different point, back.
Yeah, not the Big
Yeah,
Bang, but some earlier point. And so,
yeah.
again, it's not a rigorous proof. It's all in the realm of speculation. These are not rigorous proofs. But I mean, I don't see how we'll know unless God reveals it. And and St. Thomas would say he has revealed it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But
Right.
but I would say if the place to the smart money is on the universe having had a beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, do you think, just a final question, because, obviously we're learning new things about the universe all the time. And so for example, dark energy and like dark matter, we don't fully know, what those things are. And the people observations suggest maybe dark energy may have fluctuated in terms of the force, and so made that change, yeah, the ability of the universe to bounce or to be infinite, or so. Would
Right. So
something
we're
like that
learning.
have impact on
Yeah.
this question?
It does have an impact. So it used to be thought there's this strange stuff called dark energy, eh, and what people have thought since it was discovered to be there in 1998. People have thought that it was the amount of it is constant with time. And if it is, then it is what is traditionally called the cosmological constant. It means it's a kind of an effect in Einstein's theory of gravity, uh, which has the effect. This cosmological constant has the effect of kind of accelerating the expansion of the universe, and that's how people discovered it, because they found out that the universe had been slowing, its expansion had been slowing down for billions of years. And then they found evidence that billions of years ago, the expansion sped up, that it started to accelerate. And that was discovered in 1998. And so that seemed to suggest that the universe is not going to recollapse. There's always been this uh, two possibilities: the universe is going to expand forever, or the universe is going to expand, reach a maximum extent, and then recollapse, either to a big crunch and the universe ends, or maybe conceivably it bounces, and then you have another cycle. But it seems if the universe's expansion is accelerating, uh, then it seems it's not going to recollapse. It's just going to keep
Right.
expanding faster and faster. And that has been what people have thought since 1998, that probably the universe will just keep expanding forever, unless something happens to make the dark energy go away. Um, but the dark energy seemed to be constant. It seemed to be this thing called the cosmological constant, in which case it wouldn't go away. But there seemed to be some rumblings, some hints now that the dark energy, the amount of it, the density of it is not a constant, that it's changing with time. And I think from talking to a cosmologist friend of mine, that I think there's some evidence that it might be decreasing. So it could be that the dark energy goes away at some point. If it goes away, then all bets are off.
Yeah,
If it
right,
goes
okay.
away, the acceleration of the universe would stop, and it could then start to recollapse again. So again, now both options are on the table: the perpetual expansion or the recollapse. So there was actually going to be a talk at our next conference in June. That's going to talk about all this, and the talk is given by one of the members of the board of SCS, Bob Scherer, who is a professor at the Ohio State University. No, he's not. He's at Vanderbilt now. He used to be at Ohio State. He's at Vanderbilt.
Right.
He, in fact, is the former chair of the physics department there. He's a cosmologist and actually one of the world's leading experts on dark energy and on models in which the dark energy changes. So he is like
Yeah.
the go-to guy. He's going to give a talk on how is the universe going to end at our conference in June, which I'm very much looking forward to, because I'd
Yeah,
like
yeah.
to
So
learn
for
more.
people listening to this, that's the June 2026 conference. So if it's before June 2026, you can wait to hear that. And if if you're listening to this after June 2026, you could probably find his talk on our website.
Right. It'll
If
be
we'll
live
post those. Yeah.
streamed, though. If you're a member of SCS, please come to the conference. But it'll be live streamed, and you can find the live stream on the Society of Catholic Science website. And then after a period of a month or so, we'll have it up on our YouTube channel, the actual and the SES website. We talk, so you'll be able to watch it.
All right. Well, that's a great place to end there, Steve. Get a little plug in for our annual conference and in early June. And this year it's at Mundelein Seminary outside of Chicago. So, um, yeah, thanks. It was great to talk to you about these things, Steve, creation and the Big Bang, and get some little bit of philosophy, a little bit of theology, a little bit of physics. um, and, I could pepper you with more and more questions. So maybe we'll have to come back and ask a little bit more about the cosmology side and maybe get Bob Shearer on here to talk a little bit
Yeah,
about dark energy too. I think that's a fascinating scientific topic. So,
it's a fun topic, and I really enjoyed talking about it, and, we'll have to do this again
yeah.
sometime.
All right, great.
Alright,
Thanks again, Steve.
okay.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Catholic Scientist Podcast, sponsored by the Society of Catholic Scientists. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing. And you can also show your support by donating to the Society to help us produce content like you just heard. You can donate by going to our website at catholicscientist.org and clicking on the donate button. You can also find other useful resources, articles, and videos on our website.